You're strapped into an open cockpit biplane in 1935, wind clawing at your goggles, the world a blur of canvas and sky. Your hand closes on a gun that sounds like someone tearing the heavens open with a chainsaw. This is the Vickers K, a lithe, screaming little monster born to bite from above. It was designed to trade weight for breathless rate of fire. And later, in the wrong hands, it became a tool of pure, terrifying surprise on the ground. You're strapped into an open cockpit biplane in 1935, wind clawing at your goggles, the world a blur of canvas and sky. Your hand closes on a gun that sounds like someone tearing the heavens open with a chainsaw. This is the Vickers K, a lithe, screaming little monster born to bite from above. It was designed to trade weight for breathless rate of fire. And later, in the wrong hands, it became a tool of pure, terrifying surprise on the ground. If you want to understand what made the Vickers K sound the way it did, you have to stop thinking about it as a gun and start thinking about it as a mechanical rhythm. Most of its contemporaries were designed around long, measured mechanical cycles. The bolt traveled, energy was bled, parts returned. That's fine for stability. But the Vickers K's designers asked a different question. How do we make the cycle as short and as violent as possible while remaining reliable? The answer lay in three brutal, tidy choices. First, the stroke. The distance the bolt had to travel was reduced, sometimes by as much as 40% compared with similar guns. Less travel equals less time. Second, spring tension. Return springs were heavier and the buffers stripped down. The bolt slammed back and returned faster, an action that looks almost reckless until you realize it's controlled. Third, the gas regulator, adjustable, tunable, and intentionally temperamental. With a turn of the screw, an armorer could dial the gun for sustainable discipline or, if they dared, for a hair-raising fury. Combine those choices and you cross an invisible threshold. Mechanically, the gun is capable of completing its cycle so quickly that you start to lose the discrete identity of each shot. 20 rounds per second become to the ear a continuous ripping sound instead of separate reports. Turn the regulator further, and at the cost of heat, stress, and consumables, the instrument becomes a blur, 40 rounds a second, now well beyond what human hearing can parse as individual events. Now look at the magazine architecture, the pan drum. It's an inheritance from the Lewis family, but refined with field pragmatism. Belts are excellent, until you bounce over a dune at 40 miles per hour and the feed jams on a fender. Drums are self-contained, sealed-ish, and they carry 100 rounds without an assistant to babysit them. The spring-driven feed in a Vickers pan was made to tolerate angles, jolts, and the occasional sand grain. In an aircraft or on a Jeep, that matters more than a few extra rounds on a belt. And then there is the barrel. Quick change. A small lever and a practiced hand could swap a glowing tube in under 10 seconds, a lifesaver at altitude with thick gloves. But quick change is a mitigation, not a cure. At rates approaching 1,000 to 2,000 rounds per minute, thermal reality is merciless. Metal stores heat. Steel expands. Accuracy evaporates. So doctrine evolved. Short, violent bursts, 3 to 5 seconds, then cool. Discipline and choreography replace continuous suppression. It's worth pausing here on logistics, because tactical brilliance often smolders out on the altar of supply. The Vickers K fired the same .303 British round as the rifles of the Empire. That single choice simplified ammunition flows and saved lives. Yet the price was weight in drums. A Jeep with 4 Vickers K guns needed dozens of drums to have meaningful endurance, and drums are bulky and heavy. In the uncanny arithmetic of mobile raids, you could carry enough lead to make a city scream, or you could carry enough fuel and water to get home. The trade-offs had to be managed, and they were. Through creativity, drums stacked, bungees, improvised racks, and a brutal discipline about when to let the gun sing. Mechanism. Magazine, barrel, and supply, these are the practical skeleton. But the gun's brutal character came from the relationship between these parts and human perception. When the cyclic rate exceeds the brain's ability to count, the weapon no longer communicates as a succession of bullets. It communicates as a continuous event, an overwhelming industrial roar that maps directly onto the fight-or-flight centers of the body. That acoustic threshold is part weapon, part psychology, and it's where the Vickers K left its most permanent mark. By 1940, the Vickers K's destiny began to split. Airframes evolved toward enclosed turrets and hydraulics. Single-seat fighters eliminated the observer role that birthed the gun. Suddenly, warehouses filled with lightweight, high-rate aircraft guns that were redundant for their original purpose. For many, the sensible path was scrap. For a certain kind of soldier, one who thought in terms of strikes, surprise, and mobility, redundancy was opportunity. Small, unconventional units saw that an aircraft gun is, at its heart, a volume of fire tool, light, man-portable, within reason, and capable of creating chaos quickly. The Special Air Service, the military's nascent answer to deep strike and disruption, needed precisely that. Their doctrine would be mobility over mass, speed over staying power. David Sterling, bold, relentless, and unimaginably imaginative, realized that a Jeep bristling with Vickers K guns could become an operative's thunderbolt. The conversion was modular and improvisational. Mounts were welded in field workshops, heavy base plates bolted through floor pans, stout posts cut to clear the windscreen, swivel pivots ground to a working tolerance. Armorers in Cairo and Benghazi learned to shape metal under deadline pressure. They worked from sketches drawn by men who had actually done the fighting. Early operations proved the idea. One Vickers K on a Jeep was a significant force multiplier. Two were better. Four became a form of vehicular terror. Imagine a desert night. Jeeps, painted a peculiar pink beige to vanish in dawn light, slip over dunes by compass and fuel gauge. Engines purr, then scream. In formation, they burst into an airfield, guns already hot. The Vickers K's role in that moment is not to aim true so much as to saturate. The weapon sprays lead and metal shrapnel across tarmac, into fuel drums, into the thin skin of parked aircraft. Aircraft are delicate. Their skins, instruments, and fuel lines do not expect a hurricane of 303 rounds. A few well-directed bursts shred fabric, ignite fuel, and set off sympathetic detonations. The effect is physical destruction and a psychological unraveling. Tactics evolved fast. Crews learned to coordinate bursts, to stagger their fire to avoid cooking barrels, to rotate gunners and guns during a raid. Ammunition procedures became art, which drums to carry, how to secure them under tarps, how to feed drums quickly in the jolt of a Jeep. The gun's quirks shaped doctrine, and doctrine fed back into hardware. Lighter mounts, better ammo racks, quick-win keys for pan springs wrapped in cloth to keep out desert grit. Success on the ground changed how the Vickers K was seen. It ceased to be merely an aircraft defensive weapon and became an instrument of shock. The German and Italian accounts from North Africa are blunt. The name they gave the weapon wasn't a model number. It was a sound. That alone tells you what mattered. Not the technical specs on a ledger, but the immediate physiological response in a man wearing a tin hat and a sentry's rhythm. SAS raids in 1941-1942 were surgical in concept and monstrous in execution. A few dozen men, dozens of jeeps, and hundreds of drums of 303 could strike airfields, fuel dumps, and harbors with a speed larger forces could not match. They did not seek a prolonged firefight. They wanted disruption, destruction, and the sowing of panic. The Vickers K, for all its maintenance headaches, was perfectly suited to that role. Cheap to operate in terms of crew size, ferocious in the opening seconds, and devastating against the thin-skinned, logistic-rich targets that populate a rear area. Yet this brilliance had limits. The gun's wild appetite for heat and ammunition meant that those initial victories came at logistic and maintenance costs. Springs broke, gas regulators wore out, and the drum mechanisms, elegant but delicate, succumbed to sand. The weapon's very strengths demanded a support network that was sometimes hard to sustain in long-range operations across an unforgiving desert. Still, for the moments when surprise mattered most, the Vickers K delivered a psychological leverage that outstripped its mechanical fragility. Weapons leave scars on both metal and mind. The Vickers K's deepest wound was not a physical scar you could measure with calipers. It was an impression left on the nervous system of those who heard it. That ripping, continuous howl didn't just indicate danger, it collapsed a soldier's cognitive space. The brain can parse roughly 10 to 15 discrete events a second. At 20 or 40 rounds a second, the Vickers K crosses the boundary where individual shots blur into an uninterrupted mechanical roar. That auditory transformation is a weapon in itself. Sound is a short, brutal language in battle. A single rifle crack tells you distance and direction. The slower pulse of a heavy machine gun telegraphs its rhythm. You can find gaps, time movement, even plan an escape. The Vickers K's sound did something different. It erased the rhythm. It turned the world into a steady-state assault, a mechanical wind that suggested continuous, unstoppable energy. When multiple Vickers K guns opened on a target simultaneously, 2, 4, 8 from a line of jeeps, the result was auditory saturation. The sound wasn't merely loud. It was a cognitive overload that directed the body's most primitive response: curl, hide, freeze. This is why the Vickers K's impact was as much tactical as it was physical. Consider the typical SAS raid on an enemy airfield at dawn. The attackers navigated hundreds of miles, timed their arrival to the hour when crews would be groggy and aircraft vulnerable. The first sensory clue for the defenders wasn't an approaching engine, but a tearing roar from multiple directions, a sound that arrived already 50 to 100 rounds deep. By the time a sentry registered where the noise came from, a wall of lead had already saturated his position. The attack's psychological sequencing was perfect: surprise, immediate dominance of senses, and rapid physical destruction, all within seconds. Intelligence and after-action reports from Axis forces are revealing. They don't catalog precise casualty counts as much as they describe paralysis. Men who had stood fast against artillery and disciplined machine gun nests described a different reaction to the Vickers K: bewilderment. The noise, the spread, and the speed of the strikes turned trained responses into instinctive survival. Officers found their men pinned down, not because they were physically suppressed in the long term, but because the initial violence disoriented every cognitive plan to resist. This is the crux of why the Vickers K mattered beyond its muzzle velocity: suppression as doctrine. Conventional armies value accuracy and sustained defensive fire. Suppressive fire exists to shape the ground for maneuver and to force enemies into cover. But the Vickers K instantiated a doctrine of immediate, overwhelming suppression. Not a slow constriction, but a sudden inundation. It was especially effective against soft, logistic-rich targets: aircraft on ramps, fuel depots, supply convoys, and port facilities. Everything there is vulnerable to high-volume, short-duration punishment. The point isn't to outshoot a machine gun. It's to make the environment lethal in the first few seconds. There is another lineage worth tracing here: modern weapons that echo the Vickers K's philosophy. The A-10's GAU-8 Avenger and helicopter-mounted miniguns are descendants not in parts but in approach. They are designed to deliver such concentrated fire that precision becomes a secondary concern. Pilots and crews aim the platform, not individual bullets. They rely on area suppression to control the battlefield and protect Allied forces. The auditory signature of these modern systems still unnerves soldiers. The sound becomes synonymous with imminent, unstoppable violence. The Vickers K was an early, smaller-scale expression of that same brutal logic, but every doctrine invites counters. The Vickers K's success forced the Axis to adapt. Commanders dispersed aircraft, moved fuel and ammo into hardened shelters, and devoted troops to airfield security that might otherwise have been elsewhere. The strategic ripple effect mattered. A few dozen raids could force the enemy to dilute resources across rear areas, reducing frontline strength. On the tactical scale, defenders learned to anticipate raids, to harden positions, and to prepare quick reaction forces. Yet the fundamental asymmetry remained. A few fast vehicles with overwhelming initial firepower could still strike where the enemy was thinnest. Finally, we must be honest about limits: heat, logistics, the gun's aging design. Its brilliance was temporal. By 1943 and into 1944, battlefield conditions changed. Different theaters, tougher fortifications, heavier vehicles. The Vickers K's thin-skinned, high-volume approach had less purchase against hardened positions or armored columns. Newer, heavier weapons with greater range and stopping power began to replace it. But replacement does not mean irrelevance. The tactical and psychological lesson of the Vickers K, that sound and sudden volume can be as decisive as pinpoint accuracy, rippled outward and informed modern concepts of shock, suppression, and close support that survive to this day. Most hardware ages into obsolescence. The Vickers K did so too. By 1945, it was largely gone from frontline service, a few relics scraping through in the Far East or colonial policing roles. Many were scrapped, some sold into surplus, and a handful survive in museums and private collections where they draw curious hands and older veterans' memories. But the gun's true legacy is not the metal that remains. It's the doctrine it helped make audible. Modern battlefield thinking still borrows the Vickers K's central insight. Suppressive volume and the psychological weight of sound are decisive tools. The WWII, the minigun, vehicle-mounted autocannons, they are bigger, louder, more lethal, but they are conceptually kin. They accept inaccuracy at the level of individual rounds for a brutal aggregated effect. The A-10 pilot does not promise a precise slug to every target. They promise an area will be denied, a threat neutralized, a corridor opened. That promise is a direct descendant of what SAS Jeeps and Vickers K drums once delivered across dusty North African dawns. There is also a human story threaded through iron and doctrine. Weapons that simplify the skill of killing change who has chosen to wield them. The Vickers K allowed men without months of sniper training to create decisive effects. That democratization of lethality is morally complicated. It makes certain operations possible, but also widens the circle of who can cause devastation. History remembers the strategy more kindly than it does the cost. A raid that destroyed supply lines saved lives at the front but endangered others in rear areas. The ethical ledger remains ambiguous. Finally, the sound. To older soldiers who heard it, the Vickers K remains a sensory signifier, not just gun, but a memory of panic, of machines and men, of nights broken by a tearing roar. To us, detached by time, it's a lesson. Warfare is not only physics and ballistics, it's perception, timing, and the exploitation of human neurology. The Vickers K's genius wasn't that it was the most accurate or the heaviest hitter. It was that it altered perception faster than a man could aim. It turned seconds into strategic advantage. So when you listen now to recordings of aircraft guns, to the spool of a rotary cannon, to the mechanical howl that precedes violence, remember the little aircraft gun that taught the world how to terrify with rhythm and volume. The Vickers K's metal may be mostly gone, but its lesson lives on. In doctrine, in sound, and in the simple, savage math that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is also the most effective.